It started on a sunny Saturday morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of day where you sip coffee on the porch and the faint hum of lawnmowers blends with the chatter of bargain hunters drifting from house to house. My husband, Mark, and I had decided to explore the local yard sales. It was a simple plan. Find a few trinkets, maybe an old record or a quirky piece of furniture. We were never prepared for what we'd bring home instead. The sale was tucked away at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by gnarled oak trees. It wasn't on our map, and the hand-painted sign nailed to a post read, "Estate sale, everything must go." Intrigued, we parked and walked in, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the stillness. The house itself was dilapidated, its paint peeling, windows clouded with grime. The yard was strewn with an odd assortment of items: vintage lamps, chipped porcelain figurines, dusty books, and boxes of faded Polaroids. A thin, elderly woman in a wide-brimmed hat sat in a folding chair near the entrance. She didn't greet us, only nodded slightly as we walked past. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but my attention snagged on an old wooden jewelry box sitting on a table. It was intricately carved with swirling patterns, darkened with age. The latch creaked when I opened it, revealing a velvet-lined interior with compartments for rings and necklaces. But it was empty. Something about it called to me, though. I don't know if it was the craftsmanship or the way it seemed to radiate a strange energy. I turned to the old woman and asked how much it was. She looked at me, her pale blue eyes cold and unwavering. $5, she said, her voice raspy and thin. I handed her a crumpled bill, and she whispered, "It belonged to her." Before I could ask who her was, she turned her attention to the next customer, her demeanor dismissive. That should have been my first warning. When we got home, I placed the jewelry box on my dresser. Mark teased me, saying I'd paid too much for a box of dust. But I shrugged it off. I felt oddly attached to it, as though it had chosen me. That night, I woke suddenly to the sound of soft metallic clinking. At first, I thought it was Mark moving around in his sleep, but when I turned, he was snoring quietly. The sound continued, faint but persistent. It was coming from the jewelry box. I flipped on the bedside lamp and stared at it. The lid was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it. My heart thudded as I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a single gold ring, one I hadn't seen before. "Mark," I whispered, shaking him awake. He groaned and sat up groggily. "Look at this." He squinted at the ring, then at me. "Are you sure it wasn't there before?" "I'm positive," I said, my voice trembling. The ring was simple but elegant, with an inscription on the inside. I couldn't quite make it out in the dim light, so I set it down and resolved to examine it in the morning. The following day, the ring was gone. I tore apart the bedroom looking for it, even accusing Mark of playing a prank, but he swore he hadn't touched it. I felt uneasy, but Mark brushed it off, saying it must have been my imagination. That evening, strange things started happening. The house grew colder, no matter how high we set the thermostat. Lights flickered. Objects seemed to shift positions when we weren't looking. And then there were the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. I started having vivid nightmares. In one, I saw a woman with long, dark hair standing at the foot of our bed. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken. She wore a tattered dress, and her hands were clasped around something. When I looked closer, I realized it was the ring. "Give it back?" she whispered, her voice hollow and echoing. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Mark tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He admitted he'd started hearing the whispers too, and once he thought he saw a shadow dart across the hallway when he was home alone. Desperate for answers, we searched the internet for anything about the estate sale or the house it had been held at. What we found chilled us to the bone. The house had belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had been reclusive and eccentric. She was rumored to have been involved in witchcraft or the occult, and she had died under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors claimed to hear strange noises coming from the house even after her death, and anyone who entered reported feeling an oppressive presence. We decided to get rid of the jewelry box. I couldn't stand to have it in the house anymore. We drove to a nearby lake and threw it in, watching as it sank into the murky water. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, the whispers grew louder. The temperature in the house plummeted, and a foul stench filled the air. Then, as we lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, we heard a loud crash from the living room. We crept down the hallway armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat. The living room was in shambles. Furniture overturned, picture frames shattered, and sitting in the middle of the coffee table was the jewelry box, water dripping from its wooden surface. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Mark grabbed my hand and pulled me out of the house. We drove to a motel that night, too afraid to return. The next day, we contacted a local paranormal investigator. She came to the house, her expression grim as she walked through the rooms. She told us the box was a conduit, a link to Eleanor's spirit. By taking it, we had invited her into our lives. "You need to return it to the house," she said, "and leave it there." We followed her advice, driving back to the abandoned estate under the cover of darkness. The house loomed ominously, its windows like black holes. We placed the jewelry box on the porch and didn't look back. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. The whispers stopped, the house felt warm again, and I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. But sometimes when I pass a yard sale, I feel an inexplicable pull, like something or someone is watching me, waiting for me to stop.
Story number 2.
It was the kind of yard sale that screamed trouble, but curiosity always got the better of me. I should have turned the car around the moment I saw the house. Its rotting wood siding and boarded-up windows weren't exactly inviting. But something about the crooked sign scrawled with "Yard Sale, Antiques and Treasures" pulled me in like a moth to a flame. The yard was a disarray of mismatched furniture, old toys, and rusted tools. No one else was there. Just me and an older man with hollowed cheeks and eyes that seemed too bright for his gaunt face. He stood silently, arms crossed, watching me as if he was waiting for something. I browsed, trying not to look at him too much. The air around the house felt heavy, like it pressed against my skin. On a table near the back, I found it. An old porcelain doll, about a foot tall, dressed in a faded blue dress with lace trim. Its face was cracked but intact, with one glassy blue eye staring forward and the other slightly misaligned. I didn't want it. I hate dolls. But as I turned to walk away, I heard a whisper, not a voice, but a whisper. Faint and dry, like leaves scraping against pavement. "Take her." I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The old man hadn't moved. His face was as expressionless as before. I looked back at the doll, and I swear its good eye was locked on me. "How much for this?" I asked, my voice trembling. He smirked, his lips curling just enough to make my stomach churn. "She's free. Always has been." My instinct screamed at me to leave it, to walk away, but I grabbed the doll and muttered a hasty thanks before practically running back to my car. I tossed it onto the passenger seat, not daring to look at it during the drive home. When I got there, I shoved the doll into a box in the garage and tried to forget about it. But forgetting wasn't an option. That night, I woke up to the sound of soft giggles. They were faint, high-pitched, like a child's laugh, but distorted, as if coming through an old broken radio. I froze, straining to hear, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard footsteps, tiny, deliberate footsteps padding across the hardwood floor outside my bedroom. I wanted to wake my boyfriend Eric, but he wasn't there. He was working the night shift. It was just me, alone. The giggling stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the sound of the bedroom door creaking open. I stared at it, my breath shallow, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The door opened slowly, revealing nothing but darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Something was there. I fumbled for the bedside lamp and turned it on, flooding the room with light. The door was wide open, but the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Just some twisted dream brought on by stress. But deep down, I knew better. When Eric got home, I told him everything. He laughed it off, saying I'd scared myself silly over a doll. He went to the garage, grabbed the box, and plopped the doll on the kitchen counter. "See? Just a creepy old toy," he said, poking its cracked face. I hated the way it stared at me, that one misaligned eye seeming to shift whenever I wasn't looking directly at it. I told Eric I wanted it gone, and he agreed to take it to the dump the next day. That night, the giggling returned. This time it was louder, closer. I bolted upright in bed and turned on the light, but the room was empty. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, making me jump. It was a text from Eric, who was working late again. "Did you move the doll? Thought you wanted it in the garage." I stared at the message, confused. I hadn't touched it. I texted back, "No, it's still on the counter, isn't it?" His reply came almost immediately. "It's not there. I just heard something in the living room. Thought it might be you." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a metal lamp, and crept toward the living room. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive. When I reached the living room, my blood turned to ice. The doll was sitting on the couch, its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching the TV that wasn't on. I didn't even think. I grabbed it, shoved it into a trash bag, and ran outside. Eric pulled into the driveway just as I was tossing the bag into the garbage bin. "What are you doing?" he asked, stepping out of the car. "It's cursed," I said, my voice shaking. "We're getting rid of it." He laughed, but his smile faded when he saw the look on my face. "Okay," he said. "We'll take it to the dump first thing tomorrow." But the doll didn't wait for morning. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of glass shattering. I ran to the living room, where I found the trash bag torn open and the doll sitting on the coffee table, surrounded by shards of the sliding glass door. Its cracked porcelain face was smeared with dirt, and its misaligned eye seemed to gleam in the moonlight. Eric called a priest the next day. He wasn't religious, but he'd finally admitted something wasn't right. The priest blessed the house, muttering prayers and sprinkling holy water, but when he saw the doll, his face went pale. "You need to destroy this," he said, his voice trembling. "Burn it. Don't bury it. Burn it and scatter the ashes far from here." We did as he said. Eric built a fire in the backyard, and we threw the doll in, watching as the flames consumed it. The air was filled with an acrid, choking stench. And for a moment, I thought I heard a scream, a shrill, ear-piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When it was over, we buried the ashes miles away. For weeks, the house felt normal again. No giggles, no footsteps, no whispers. I started to believe it was over. But last night, as I was falling asleep, I heard it, a faint giggle, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps moving closer.
Story number 3.
I never really liked yard sales. Something about rummaging through other people's old belongings felt intrusive. But that day, my friend Clara convinced me to join her. She was a yard sale enthusiast, always searching for hidden treasures. I tagged along, mostly to humor her, and I wish I hadn't. The sale was in a rural area, far off the beaten path. The house was old, Victorian style, with chipped paint and ivy crawling up its sides. The yard was full of items that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Antique furniture, old paintings, and boxes of random knickknacks. A man in his 60s sat silently in a rocking chair on the porch, his gaze fixed on something far away. He didn't greet us, and his stillness made me uneasy. Clara was in her element, diving into boxes and inspecting every item. I wandered aimlessly until a small mirror caught my eye. It was beautiful, with an ornate silver frame shaped like twisting vines. The glass was oddly dark, almost black, but it reflected perfectly when I tilted it toward the light. I wasn't sure why I wanted it, but something about it felt magnetic. Clara noticed me holding it and smiled. "Finally found something you like?" she teased. The man on the porch spoke then, his voice low and gravelly. $10 for the mirror." I hesitated. His voice felt like sandpaper on my nerves. But before I could respond, Clara piped up, "She'll take it." I handed him the money, avoiding his piercing gaze, and we left shortly after. That night, I hung the mirror in my bedroom. It fit perfectly on the wall opposite my bed. I admired it for a while, the way the silver frame seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Then I went to bed, feeling oddly satisfied. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I thought it was a bad dream, but something felt off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the room seemed darker than usual. That's when I noticed it. The mirror wasn't reflecting my room. Instead, it showed something else entirely. It was still my bedroom, but distorted. The walls were cracked, and the furniture was warped, almost melting. The worst part was the figure standing in the center of the reflection. It was a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in long, wet strands over her face. She wore a tattered gown, and her hands were twisted, claw-like. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the mirror. I sat frozen in bed, unable to breathe. Slowly, the woman began to lift her head, revealing hollow black eyes. She wasn't in the room, just in the mirror, but she seemed to be looking right at me. When she opened her mouth, it was too wide, unnatural, and then she screamed. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was inside my head, a shrill, piercing wail that made me clamp my hands over my ears and curl into a ball. But no matter how tightly I shut my eyes, I couldn't block her out. When I finally worked up the courage to look at the mirror again, it was normal. Just a mirror, reflecting my terrified face and disheveled room. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, but I knew better. The next morning, I told Clara about it. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as stress or an overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. I tried to take the mirror off the wall, but it wouldn't budge. The screws were loose, yet the frame felt as though it were glued to the wall. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed put. That night, I decided to cover it with a blanket. I thought if I couldn't see it, it couldn't hurt me. But at 3 a.m., I woke up to a soft rustling sound. The blanket had fallen to the floor, and the mirror was uncovered. The woman was back. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, shadowy figures writhed and twisted, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't have faces, just dark, amorphous shapes that pulsed and flickered like firelight. She raised one clawed hand and pointed directly at me. My body went cold. The shadows behind her surged forward, pressing against the surface of the mirror. The glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass didn't shatter. It absorbed the impact like it was made of liquid, then returned to its original state. The figures inside grew more agitated, pressing harder, their movements frantic. I ran out of the room and didn't return until daylight. The next day, I called the man who had sold me the mirror. His voice was calm when he answered, almost too calm. "I warned you," he said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "No, you didn't," I snapped. "You didn't say anything." "I didn't need to. That mirror finds who it wants. You shouldn't have taken it." "What am I supposed to do with it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Get rid of it," he said simply. "But don't break it. Whatever you do, don't break it." He hung up before I could ask anything else. That night, I decided to take the mirror back to the house. Clara insisted on coming with me. We drove in silence, the mirror wrapped in an old sheet in the back seat. When we arrived, the house was dark. The rocking chair on the porch was empty, swaying slightly in the breeze. We left the mirror on the porch and hurried back to the car, but as we pulled onto the road, Clara let out a gasp. The mirror was in the back seat, wrapped in the same sheet, sitting exactly where we'd left it. I slammed on the brakes, my chest tightening with panic. Clara was sobbing, clutching the dashboard. I got out of the car and yanked the mirror out, placing it on the ground by the side of the road. We drove off again, but when we got home, it was waiting for us in the living room. I don't know how to escape it. The woman comes every night now, bringing her shadowy companions. They whisper things I can't understand, but I feel their hatred, their hunger. I've stopped sleeping. I've stopped eating. The mirror is always there, watching, waiting. And I know one day they'll find a way out.
Story number 4.
I should have known better than to stop. The yard sale wasn't like the cheerful suburban ones with balloons and kids selling lemonade. This one felt wrong. The house was an old farmhouse, sagging under its own weight, surrounded by a crooked picket fence. The items on display were bizarre. A rusted scythe, weathered dolls missing limbs, faded books with titles in languages I couldn't read. But the worst part was the silence. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of distant cars. Just nothing. An old man sat behind a folding table. His eyes were milky white like cataracts had taken over, but he didn't move like a blind man. He seemed to track my every step perfectly. I felt his gaze, heavy and unblinking, as I browsed the items. On a dusty table, I saw it, a hand-carved wooden box about the size of a cigar case. Intricate symbols were etched into its surface, and the wood seemed unnaturally dark, almost black. When I opened it, there was nothing inside but a faint smell of burnt wood. "How much for this?" I asked, my voice cracking in the oppressive silence. The man smiled, his yellowed teeth crooked and sharp. "Take it," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's already yours." I wanted to leave it, to walk away, but my hand wouldn't let go. Something about the box felt alive, pulsating faintly in my palm. Against every ounce of better judgment, I nodded, tucked it under my arm, and left without another word. That night, I placed the box on my kitchen counter, still trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just a piece of wood, that my imagination was running wild. But as I got ready for bed, I couldn't stop glancing at it, expecting something. Around midnight, I woke to a soft tapping sound. It wasn't coming from the walls or the window. It was coming from the box. My heart pounded as I approached it, the tapping growing louder with each step. When I finally lifted the lid, the sound stopped, and the air seemed to grow colder. Inside the box was a small folded piece of paper. I swear it hadn't been there before. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The paper was blank. I stared at it, confused, before a sudden sharp pain shot through my palm. I dropped the paper, and when I looked at my hand, there was a deep red scratch, fresh and glistening. I looked back at the box, and now the symbols on its surface seemed to glow faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. The next few nights were worse. I started hearing whispers, faint and unintelligible, coming from the box. The shadows in my house grew darker, deeper, as if they were stretching toward me. I tried to get rid of the box, threw it into the woods behind my house, but it always came back. I'd find it in the same spot on my counter, its lid slightly ajar, as though it were taunting me. One night, I woke to find the box in my bed. I hadn't touched it, hadn't brought it back inside, but there it was, resting on the pillow next to me like a sleeping companion. My room was icy cold, and the whispers were louder now, like dozens of voices overlapping, all speaking in a language I didn't understand. I screamed and threw the box across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, and the whispers stopped, but only for a moment. Then the box began to shake, vibrating violently on the floor. The lid flew open, and a thick black smoke poured out, filling the room. From the smoke emerged a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and a face that was more of a void than a face. Its presence was suffocating, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It pointed one spindly finger at me, and in that moment, the whispers became clear. You are ours. I don't remember how I escaped the house. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car, shaking uncontrollably, staring at the darkened windows of my home. I drove to Clara's place. She was the only person I could think to call. When I told her everything, she looked at me like I was insane, but she agreed to come back with me. The house was eerily silent when we returned. The box was gone, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was watching us. Clara tried to reassure me, said I was just overtired, that I'd imagined it all. But as she was speaking, the lights flickered, and the whispers started again. We both froze. The box reappeared on the counter, its lid open wide. The black smoke began to seep out once more, and Clara screamed, bolting for the door. But it was too late. The figure was back, standing between us and the exit, its void-like face turning toward her. Clara's scream cut off abruptly as the figure reached out, its hand passing through her chest like mist. Her body collapsed to the floor, lifeless, as the figure turned its attention to me. I don't know how I survived that night. I've tried to destroy the box 12 times, burning it, burying it, throwing it into rivers, but it always comes back. I've stopped sleeping, stopped eating, waiting for the moment it finally takes me. The whispers never stop now. They're always there, just beneath the surface, reminding me that I belong to them. Sometimes I wonder if I'd have been better off leaving that box at the yard sale, but deep down, I know it wouldn't have mattered. The man was right. It was already mine.
Story number 5.
I remember the yard sale clearly, though I wish I didn't. It was one of those impulsive stops, one of those moments where curiosity leads you straight into a nightmare. The house was unassuming, perched on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The items were laid out on mismatched blankets, a mix of dusty knickknacks, rusted tools, and faded books. It was the kind of sale where you wouldn't expect to find much, but that was part of the charm. As I browsed, my attention was drawn to a peculiar item, an antique music box. It was small, carved from dark wood, and had an engraving on the top, a single word, Avum. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the winding key gleamed as if it had just been polished. The man running the sale noticed me holding it. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes had the sort of hollow look that made you feel uneasy. "That box," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "is not for everyone." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. "How much?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at me with those unsettling eyes. Finally, he said, $5, but you can't say I didn't warn you." I should have walked away. I should have left it there on the blanket, but something about the music box called to me. Without thinking, I handed him the money and carried it home. That night, I set the music box on my dresser and forgot about it until bedtime. As I was getting ready to sleep, I turned the small key, curious to hear its tune. The melody was hauntingly beautiful. It was soft and slow, like a lullaby, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As the tune played, I felt an odd chill crawl up my spine, and the air in the room grew noticeably colder. Then the melody stopped abruptly, mid-note, even though the key hadn't fully unwound. I stared at the music box, waiting for it to continue, but it didn't. Instead, the room fell into an eerie silence. I decided it was just an old mechanism acting up and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint whispers, so faint I couldn't tell if they were real or in my head. They sounded like a chorus of voices, overlapping, murmuring things I couldn't understand. Every time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The next morning, I told myself it was all in my imagination. I left for work, trying to shake the unease, but when I returned home that evening, the atmosphere in my house felt different. Heavy, like the air was thicker, harder to breathe. The music box was still on my dresser, but now the engraving on the lid seemed deeper, almost as if it had been freshly carved. I ignored it, telling myself I was overthinking things. That night, I wound it again. I don't know why. The melody started as before, soft and haunting, but this time I swore I heard faint voices behind the music. A whispering, almost chanting sound, barely audible but unmistakable. And then the shadows moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But when the largest shadow, cast by my wardrobe, began to stretch across the ceiling, I knew it wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just moving, it was writhing, twisting in unnatural ways. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My chest tightened and I felt frozen in place, unable to move or even look away from the shadows. Then I saw it. A figure began to emerge from the largest shadow. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its body seemed to flicker, like static on an old television. Its head turned toward me, but it had no face, just an endless void where its features should have been. The whispers stopped abruptly as the figure reached out a spindly hand. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. It pointed to the music box, and I understood. It wanted me to open it. I don't know what possessed me to obey, but my hand moved as if it wasn't my own. I lifted the lid and the melody began again, but this time it was faster, more frantic. The figure's body flickered violently, and the whispers returned, louder than before, like a cacophony of screams echoing in my skull. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything but the music and the voices. I felt cold fingers brush against my arm and then my chest, and I realized the figure wasn't alone. There were others, countless others surrounding me, their presence suffocating. When the lights returned, the music box was closed and the room was empty. The figure and its companions were gone. But I wasn't alone. The shadows on my walls had changed. They no longer matched the objects in my room. Instead, they writhed and pulsed as if alive. When I turned away, I could feel them watching me. I've tried to get rid of the music box. I've burned it, buried it, even thrown it into a river miles away. But it always comes back, sitting on my dresser as if it never left. The whispers are constant now, following me wherever I go. The shadows stretch farther every night, creeping closer to my bed. I haven't slept in days, too afraid of what will happen if I close my eyes. I don't know what the music box wants from me, but I know one thing. It's only a matter of time before the shadows take me.
Story number 6.
It started with a porcelain doll. I'm not one for yard sales, but I was driving through an old neighborhood when I saw it sitting on a weathered wooden table. Its eyes were a piercing blue, almost too lifelike, and its delicate face was framed by golden curls. The doll wore a faded blue dress, trimmed with lace, and its tiny hands were poised delicately in its lap. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't stop myself from picking it up. The woman running the sale was frail, her hands shaking as she counted change for another customer. When I asked her how much the doll was, she glanced at it, her expression darkening. "That one's not for sale," she said quickly, almost fearfully. "Oh, I'm sorry," I replied, setting it back down. But as I started to walk away, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Wait, take it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just don't bring it back." I hesitated, but she pushed it into my hands, refusing my offer to pay. Her eyes darted nervously toward the house, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "It's yours now," she said firmly, then turned and walked away. That night, I placed the doll on a shelf in my living room. It looked innocuous enough during the day, but as night fell, the atmosphere in my house shifted. The air grew heavy, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but when I passed the doll on my way to bed, I could have sworn its head was tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. I brushed it off, blaming the shadows, and went to sleep. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, like fabric rustling. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The noise was coming from the living room. I told myself it was nothing. maybe a draft or the sound of the house settling. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Summoning my courage, I grabbed my phone for a flashlight and crept down the hall. The living room was empty, but the doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it was sitting in the center of the coffee table, its unblinking eyes staring directly at me. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't put it there. My hands trembled as I reached for it, but the moment I touched the doll, a chill shot through my body. It was icy cold, far colder than anything in the house should have been. I put the doll back on the shelf and hurried back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a scared child. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares of blue eyes watching me from the shadows. The next day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd moved the doll and forgotten. Maybe I was just overtired. But the sense of dread lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. That evening, as I was washing dishes, I heard it again, that soft, rustling sound. This time it was accompanied by faint, rhythmic tapping, like tiny fingers drumming against wood. My throat tightened as I turned toward the living room. The doll was on the floor now, sitting upright in the middle of the rug. Its head was tilted further to the side, and its lips, once closed, were slightly parted. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My hands shook as I picked it up and shoved it into a closet, slamming the door shut. I didn't want to look at it anymore, didn't want to feel its cold presence in my house. That night, the nightmares were worse. In them, the doll was alive, its tiny hands gripping my arms as it whispered things I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of its voice still echoing in my ears. When I went to check the closet, my heart sank. The door was open, and the doll was gone. I found it sitting on my bed. Its dress was damp, as if it had been left out in the rain, and its once pristine blue eyes were clouded, milky white. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then it blinked. I screamed and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked. I drove aimlessly for hours, unsure of where to go or what to do. When I finally returned home, exhausted and terrified, the doll was back on the shelf, its eyes as clear and piercing as the day I'd brought it home. I've tried to get rid of it. I've thrown it in the trash, buried it in the woods, even drove to a landfill miles away and left it there, but it always comes back, sitting in its usual spot waiting for me. The house feels darker now, as if the doll is draining the life out of it. The rustling and tapping never stop, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear faint laughter. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's only a matter of time before it takes me.
Story number 7.
I was never one to believe in curses, but after what happened, I don't think I have a choice anymore. It all started with a strange little mirror I bought at a yard sale. It was small, maybe the size of my hand, with an ornate silver frame that looked ancient. The glass was slightly cloudy, but it still reflected clearly enough. The woman who sold it to me was odd. Her yard was filled with the usual second-hand items, but the way she watched me as I picked up the mirror made my skin crawl. "You're brave," she said, her voice soft and raspy. I laughed nervously. "Why do you say that?" Her expression darkened. "That mirror doesn't show what's there. It shows what's waiting." I thought she was just being eccentric, trying to make her junk sound mysterious. So for $5, I bought it and brought it home. At first, nothing seemed unusual. I placed the mirror on my dresser and went about my day. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of something odd in the reflection. It wasn't much, just a flicker of movement in the corner of the glass, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just tired. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. I'd see fleeting shadows in the mirror that didn't match anything in the room, or faint shapes moving behind me that disappeared when I turned to look. One night, as I stared into the mirror, I noticed something chilling. My reflection wasn't matching my movements. I tilted my head to one side and it hesitated before mimicking me. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was imagining things, or maybe the mirror had some kind of flaw that made reflections look distorted. But then the nightmares started. Every night I dreamed of the mirror. In my dreams, the reflection wasn't me. It looked like me. Same face, same clothes, but its eyes were darker, emptier. It would reach out from the glass, its hand pressing against the inside of the mirror and whisper, "Let me in." I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, the sound of its voice still echoing in my ears. One night, I decided to cover the mirror with a blanket. I couldn't stand looking at it anymore. But when I woke up the next morning, the blanket was on the floor and the mirror was uncovered. Worse, the reflection had changed. The version of me in the mirror looked thinner, gaunt, as if something were draining the life out of it. Its eyes were bloodshot and its lips twisted into a cruel smile. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, staring at the covered mirror, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., the air in my room grew icy cold, and I heard it, a faint tapping sound like nails against glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I pulled the blanket off the mirror. The reflection was standing, even though I was sitting on the bed. It stared at me with hollow eyes, its face contorted into a look of pure malice. Then it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if it were trying to break through. I screamed and threw the mirror across the room. It shattered against the wall, shards of glass scattering everywhere. For a moment, I felt relief, like I'd finally broken whatever spell it held. But then the room grew darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The shards of glass on the floor began to move, sliding across the wood like they were alive. They reassembled themselves into the shape of the mirror, jagged and incomplete, and the reflection reappeared, more monstrous than ever. The tapping turned into pounding, and then the glass exploded outward, sending shards flying. From the fractured mirror crawled the reflection, a twisted, shadowy version of me, its movements jerky and unnatural. It smiled, a wide, inhuman grin, and whispered, "You let me out." I don't remember how I escaped that night. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car, parked miles away from my house, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I moved to a new apartment, bought new furniture, and tried to rebuild my life. But no matter where I go, I can feel it watching me. Every reflective surface, windows, puddles, even the screen of my phone, feels wrong, like it's not really me staring back. I don't use mirrors anymore. I can't, because every time I see my reflection, I catch a glimpse of that other version of me, waiting in the shadows, its dark eyes filled with hunger.